After a week of chaotic messaging from the U.S. president, it seems Donald Trump has decided tariffs will be implemented next week. In a social media post this morning, Trump wrote, "Drugs are still pouring into our country from Mexico and Canada at very high and unacceptable levels. Until it stops or is seriously limited, the proposed tariffs, all caps, scheduled to go into effect on March 4th, all caps, will indeed go into effect as scheduled." We're joined now by the CBC's Katie Simpson, who's following this rapidly bouncing ball. So, Katie, Trump suggests his mind is made up on tariffs. What more did he say today?
Yeah, suggesting that Canada and Mexico and China, for that matter, have not done enough to stop the flow of illegal drugs into the United States. Now, I want to say we've seen this movie before, and Donald Trump, he sees himself as a disruptor, and in this moment, his mind might be made up. However, what I keep hearing from people who've dealt with Donald Trump before, including I spoke today with David McNaughton, the former Canadian ambassador to the U.S., till he actually does it, you don't know what he's going to do. So he can say it now. But Donald Trump was in the Oval Office. He's hosting Keir Starmer, for the British Prime Minister, for a visit. And he was asked about, the changes that Canada has made at the border and how Canada is responsible for less than 1% of the illegal fentanyl that does make its way into the United States. And here's what Donald Trump had to say to that.
Because they should be apprehending much more. They're only apprehending 1%. You're right about that. It's a little more than that. But they should be apprehending much more because a lot comes through Canada.
So he kind of, it's when you take a look at the grand picture of things, a lot is not an accurate description of what's actually coming across the northern border. Are there challenges there that Canada is working to improve? Absolutely. But when you compare it to what's going on at the southern U.S. border, no, it's not a lot. The numbers are getting the numbers are going in a better direction. But again, Donald Trump relies on this rhetoric. He's made these complaints for months now. And so in this moment, he's saying the tariffs are going ahead. And one thing we should just remind Canadians, there are multiple layers to his tariff threats. So the March 4th tariff threat is all related to border security. He wants Canada, Mexico, and China to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States, as well as his concerns about illegal immigration into the United States. And then March 12th, the next week, he's threatening to put 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum from all over the world. So that would have a significant impact on Canada. And then April 2nd, he's got a couple of different kinds of tariffs that he wants to bring into effect. For Canada, they're expected to be sort of broad, general tariffs that are targeting long-standing irritants in the Canada-U.S. relationship. We're still waiting for details on that. There's a study being conducted by officials in the Trade Department and Commerce, working together to sort of sort out what they think the problems are and how tariffs could address it. And then on that same day, his reciprocal tariffs are going to go into effect. So right now, there's studies going on. This is largely going to affect the European Union. If there are trade barriers in other countries, Donald Trump and the United States, they want to match him. So, it's hard to keep track of, and it is our job to just try and spell it out as clearly as possible. But the big deadline for Canada in the immediate term is March 4th.
No, it's the tariff of the month, right? And a different country, different threat, different block. But, the Canadian officials, Katie, we've seen a lot of them, law enforcement, cabinet officials, all in Washington, D.C. today to try to counter all of these threats. What's going on there?
It's a big sort of Canada push in Washington, D.C. as we get closer to that deadline. David McGuinty, who's the public safety minister, the head of the CBSA, the new fentanyl czar, the head of the RCMP, all in Washington, D.C. with a whole bunch of different meetings, some going into the White House, others up on Capitol Hill. It's sort of this all-out push to try and influence the influencers. Whoever has Donald Trump's ear, they want to put that message in their ear. And we heard from leaders in the national security team just about exactly what it is, what the message is that they're delivering to whether it's a Trump administration official, whether it's a lawmaker. Have a listen.
The evidence is irrefutable. The progress is being made. In my view, any test that was put on this country, on Canada, in terms of showing progress and meeting standards for the border, I believe those have been met. Is the work finished? No. It will continue.
We are working anything we find back with our RCMP and law enforcement partners and with our American counterparts. But I just want to say, every day, the officers of CBSA are looking for fentanyl, they're looking for drugs, they're looking for firearms and contraband.
So their presentations, they're armed with specifics and statistics to try and show that changes are happening on the northern border. But again, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to Donald Trump.
Okay, let's circle back to that press conference with Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, because that's a UK-US meeting, but Canada came up in that one, Katie.
It did. So there was a question to Donald Trump about tariffs and why he keeps saying the countries pay tariffs when, in fact, it is the American importer that pays the tariff. There is some sort of economic theory about, well, we'll get into it later. It's about if China wants to continue to have access, that they'll take on the cost. But generally what happens is that the American company that has to import the good, they're the ones that pays the money, and then they pass on the price to the consumer. But Donald Trump called that a myth today. But there was a question directed at Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. He was asked about, does he have any concern about all of this rhetoric about Canada becoming the 51st state? Has it come up as an issue with the King? And he was asked sort of pointedly if there are any concerns around that. And here's what Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, had to say.
You mentioned Canada. I think you're trying to find a divide between us that doesn't exist. We're the closest of nations, and we had very good discussions today, but we didn't discuss Canada.
Thank you.
So if Canada was hoping someone was going to sort of come to its defense to say, hey, it's unacceptable that you're talking about Canada as a 51st state, or we don't think it's funny, or whatever. We're in this position in the world right now where no one wants to get on Trump's bad list and no one wants to offend him because he's thrown out threats about tariffs, all kinds of things all over the map. A lot of the European leaders who are coming to, the Emmanuel Macron, who was here this week, Keir Starmer, who's here this week, they're really focused on Ukraine and trying to ensure that there is a lasting peace deal that involves Ukraine at the table and trying to sort of, preserve peace or try to create peace in Europe. But when it comes to that comment right there, that question about, do you have any concerns about it? Trying to look for a divide, and there isn't one there.
Yeah, it's interesting to see our NATO, G7, and Commonwealth ally and, the mother parliament not have an opinion on that whole thing. Interesting thing. Katie Simpson, always a pleasure. That's the CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington. Well, David McGuinty, who you saw there, isn't the only minister in Washington today. Immigration Minister Marc Miller was also there, making the case that Canada has strengthened its border. We caught up with Miller earlier today between meetings this afternoon and before he and Minister McGuinty met with Trump's border czar, Tom Homan. Minister Miller, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me on, David.
So as we're having this conversation, you still have to have some high-level meetings with members of the Trump administration, but what's your best sense of where things stand right now? Because the White House told my colleague Alex Panetta this week that the 25% tariffs are still pending negotiations, but Trump said again today they're coming on the 4th. They're on schedule. Where do you see things at this point?
I don't think we're in any different position than the rest of Canada, David. I'm here to put our best foot forward and to work with the new administration that is, in fairness, getting itself its own footing, to make sure that we leave it all on the ice, that we leave nothing up to chance. I don't have the luxury of discounting a lot of what's being said or just blowing it off. We take it extremely seriously because it's our most important trading partner, our most important ally. So it's an re-education exercise. It's no surprise to anyone, given what's been spoken about publicly, that a large part of these discussions are dealing with fentanyl. My colleague David McGuinty is down here with Commissioner of the RCMP, Mike DeHame, and the Commissioner on Fentanyl, Kevin Brasso, to discuss that and the work we're doing to prevent the flow of fentanyl to the south. But we're also here to talk about Canada's position with respect to the US and to make sure that they know what our position is. And if there's work to be done in making sure that that common border, that we have a national security interest in making sure that it is working well, is safe and secure, works, and we can do more, then that we put that on the table. So that's the operation. There's no real guarantees, but we're here and making sure that till the bitter end, we're sticking up for Canada.
I know your colleague David McGuinty said today that the real progress has been made on the border. We've seen some stats that seizures going into the United States are way down by more than 90% compared to the same period a year ago. But Donald Trump said in the Oval Office today, Canada should be apprehending much more fentanyl, posting on social media, drugs are still pouring into our country from Mexico and Canada at very high and unacceptable levels. how do you overcome that, right? If the math and the data shows one thing, but the president says these things, does it just leave you in a perpetual state of no clarity?
I've said this before, David, we shouldn't be surprised by surprises. And this is certainly something that, while we can dispel it by pointing out to the facts and the reality that more drugs and guns pour into Canada from the US than in the other direction, there is a place where indeed we need to be doing more and demonstrating to the US that we're doing our part. It is, again, no surprise to anyone that the larger part of the focus is on the southern border of the US, that's to say Mexico, and what's going through there. But again, we're representing Canada, and we need to make sure that we're not only educating, re-educating our American partners about that relationship, about the work that we're doing and the task force and the joint strike forces that we're putting up to make sure that if there is stuff going through the border, that it is being done in illicit fashion, and that we are catching fentanyl to the extent it's a problem in Canada. There are equally as many opioid deaths per capita in Canada as there is in the US. So it's something that is hitting both of our countries quite hard.
Right.
And frankly, we need to be doing more. And that's the work that we're trying to demonstrate with the Americans, that we need to do it together. The other point that we're trying to make, and I think we're making it, is that, any action on Canada hurts the entirety of the US, whether it's no more information sharing or threats of no more information sharing, whether it's, tariffs, whether it's unilateral measures. We need to be, to the extent we agree on principle, working in lockstep to make sure that our border works. And that is about making sure that the Americans aren't creating a liability out of an asset, which is the best managed border in the world.
Well, help me reconcile, if you can, Minister, comments we've heard from Ambassador Hillman, who said that what she's hearing from people in the administration is that they think the border plan has been pretty good so far, that it is showing progress. I know Tom Homan has said that, in the early days of this, that what he's seen so far, it looks promising. But then you have the president saying what the president is saying. And I know that's kind of trying to push the boundaries maybe to force action. But what are people saying to you that you're meeting with from the House, the Senate, and from the administration in terms of whether they like what Canada has done and whether they see that it's working?
I think despite a lot of what people are hearing, there is a lot of love towards Canada. There's a little bit of ribbing about the hockey game and the 51st state stuff that is really starting to get people annoyed on our side of the border, David. But there's a lot of love towards Canada, and I think that isn't a bad takeaway. And there's a bunch of stuff that I can't frankly reconcile the facts to, nor can any Canadian. And the final decision, I guess, that is the final conclusion to all this, it is that whoever we're meeting, it isn't their decision at the end of the day. It rightly belongs to that of President Trump. And that won't be something that I think we will know until Tuesday itself or a bit before. But again, it doesn't mean that we can kind of sit on our thumbs and hope that nothing will happen. We've got to put the effort in, and as frustrating as it is, and despite pointing to reality and the good working relationship, at the end of the day, there's no guarantees. And it's really something that is the decision of the president himself.
Well, that is a remarkable thing, that no matter how many people you meet with in the administration or in the legislatures in the United States, it really does come down to a constituency of one, and getting access to Donald Trump is a difficult thing. So if what you've done to this point on the border isn't enough to satisfy the president, I know Justin Trudeau said today that you would be ready with a retaliatory response should tariffs come in. But is there more that you can offer on the border? Is there more you can offer on fentanyl and trafficking of humans across the border that you think you could elevate it from even the efforts you've put on the table so far?
I guess, well, it is what it is, I think, at the end of the day, David, but you can't leave it up to chance. It isn't as if, and just to be simply illustrative about this, that we're threatening tariffs on the US because of guns and drugs coming into Canada. We're going to react strongly to anything that the US does, but we don't think this is right or fair towards our on behalf of our closest ally. But I don't think Canadians should make any mistake in thinking that we won't fight back if need be, and we're ready to dig in for the long term. But again, I don't want to sit back and leave it all up to chance. So that's why I'm here. Why I owe it to Canadians to be, I guess, leaving it all on the ice. and that's what we're going to do.
Well, the closest you will get to the president, as I understand it today, Minister, would be Tom Homan, the border czar. So what's the argument you make to Mr. Homan? I mean, the data that Minister McGuinty and the CBSA and the RCMP have provided, is it that? Is there more to show him? And I guess going back to your point earlier, does it matter if Tom Homan is convinced, if Donald Trump is not?
You know, I don't want to leave people thinking that it doesn't matter, these meetings. I think these meetings do matter. These people are held in high regard by President Trump. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the position that they are. This isn't the first meeting we've had with them. The first meeting, I would venture to think, was something that was positive. We had our view, they had theirs. But I came out of that meeting feeling hopeful, and I hope to feel the same way coming out of this next meeting. These are people that we can work with. But again, I think at the end of the day, coming out of these meetings, it's not necessarily their final call, but it doesn't mean at the same time that these meetings are useless. So we'll keep demonstrating the fact that we've reduced the north-south flow of folks coming from Canada into the US by 89% over the last 6 months. That's important. Last week, it was down to 16. These are the US's numbers, not ours. We continue to do seizures on fentanyl and regulate precursors. That's also very important. And continue to share information about the border and our shared national security so that we can keep the North American perimeter safe. You know, this talk about getting out of Five Eyes and getting Canada out of Five Eyes makes the US weaker. It makes Canada weaker if that were to occur. And so it's not something we want to see happen, and it would be something that would be detrimental to the national safety of both Canada and the U.S.
Do you think, just as a final point, Minister, do you think that's still a live thing? Because Peter Navarro seemed to give comments walking that back dramatically, because the idea was attributed to him, and he said, no, that's crazy. Do you still think that is a live issue based on the conversations you've had in Washington?
Look, I don't think we can assume anything, David, but I think logic will prevail in this case. The U.S. does like to gather intelligence, and it needs partners in order to do that, and we're one of them.
Okay. Well, Minister Marc Miller, I know you've got to go meet with Tom Homan and others. Thanks for squeezing us in, and if there's news out of that, please come back. We'll want to hear about it. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, David.